Now, let's go ahead and get started. We wanted to open up with Robert. When we met Robert, there was one thing that in Robert's story that really hit us, and that is a lot of us are working for social change. A lot of us are working on some of these issues that we've just gone through. And when you're thinking about those issues, there's one thing that usually happens. And as somebody who studies movements and social issues and young Americans, I can tell you that people get tired. They get tired when change doesn't happen. And what you're going to hear from Robert is not only his personal journey and what affected with him, but also how his organization that he helped found has been fighting this for a very long time in general. Before I bring Robert out, I want to ask Reed Vreeland to join me. Reed is with Housing Works New York City. And what Reed is going to be doing will be introducing Robert as well. And Reed has been also working on this issue here in New York City, knows Robert, and was also actually a coworker and colleague. So we'll have a couple of friends up here talking about some of these issues. So Reed, come on out.
Thank you. So I have the distinct pleasure today to introduce Robert Suttle. Robert grew up born and raised in Louisiana, where he was working in his early career on Louisiana's Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And at that point in his life, in his, I believe, early 20s, Robert faced an unjust HIV criminalization prosecution. He was arrested, convicted, and incarcerated on one of these unjust, stigmatizing HIV criminalization laws. Upon his release in 2011, Robert has become the first person in the world, actually, to speak about his experience facing HIV criminalization and really helped start a movement to end HIV criminalization nationally, which he'll speak more about. Robert worked as assistant director at the Sero Project, which is a national network of people with HIV and allies dedicated to empowerment, ending HIV stigma, and HIV criminalization. And I would like to introduce Robert Suttle.
Thank you. Good afternoon. How are you all doing? Well, good. It's an active audience. So I'm glad to be here to share with you in regards to the work that I've been doing and to also to enlighten you, and hoping that you will leave here today with something that resonates with you. And so getting involved in the social movement for change has really been beneficial in my life. And as you've heard in my background, that I was convicted 10 years ago, actually, in the state of Louisiana under the charge of intentional exposure to the AIDS virus. I've been living with HIV for 16 years now. At the time when I was newly diagnosed, I was not aware of any specific laws that pertain to people living with HIV. And so 5 years into my diagnosis, I was faced with this issue of allegedly not disclosing my status to a partner that I was involved with. And of course, it was a consensual adult relationship. And so this experience really changed my life. And so I ended up doing 6 months in Louisiana prison, faced a felony conviction, as well as having to register as a sex offender for 15 years. And so can you imagine, in the state of Louisiana, on their driver's license, they put in big red letters the word sex offender. And so imagine carrying that around as you go through life. And so going through that experience, I didn't know anything about these criminalization laws. I didn't know any person that actually had been criminalized. And so I went online and found a blog that really explained the things that I had gone through. And I contacted my colleague, whom I've since worked with, in regards to that. And so he basically introduced me to people who were beginning to work on this issue. And I was totally unaware. I was not an activist. I was not an advocate in any way. Normally when people are newly diagnosed, they kind of go into that. I was not that person. So my introduction to the movement, if you will, the HIV movement, was through my experience of being criminalized, which of course was something that not many people living with HIV actually talked about. And so it was a concern for me as I moved into the movement, how people would perceive me. Because typically if a person thinks that if someone does not disclose their status to them, then they should be prosecuted. Something should happen to them. They should be punished. And so I wasn't sure how I was going to be received. And surprisingly, my community did receive me. They welcomed me in and they really supported me. And in so much, they allowed me to become a leader, become a voice around this issue, which at the time I was still learning, which is why I got involved in the movement, because I wanted to learn more about this issue and why it had the impact that it had in my life. And I did not want to see other people going through that experience also, because I am a regular person. I contracted HIV, just like any of us can. And also, I was someone that went to prison as any of us could go for any reason. So it can happen to anybody. And so in the movement, what I've learned is that, there are 30 plus states that have general criminal laws. They also have HIV-specific laws. So I encourage you to, go online and find out if your state has those laws. I was totally unaware. Other thing that I've learned in the movement is that these laws are so archaic, draconian, they're outdated. They don't reflect the science of what we know now around HIV. It's not like it was in the 80s. People today are living longer and healthier lives. And so HIV today is no longer a death sentence, it is a prison sentence. And so it doesn't reflect the science of the real risk and routes of transmission of HIV, which is a problem, because once antiretroviral treatment was introduced in the mid-90s, that changed everything for people living with HIV to live longer. And also, ultimately, even today, if they're on treatment and they're able to achieve an undetectable viral load, they cannot transmit HIV to anyone. And so how many of you may know that? Many of you may not, and that's okay. I'm sharing it with you today for you to learn and know that. Going forward. And so that should change the landscape of everything. The laws should change, right? Well, no, the laws never changed. No one has ever gone back to look at those laws that were introduced in the late 80s and 90s to say, hey, we need to change this now because people living with HIV cannot transmit HIV to anyone. And that's why my work is so important today, to bring awareness, to talk about the issue so that people are aware and able to govern themselves accordingly and to be empowered with knowledge to understand how to navigate through these circumstances, particularly for people living with HIV, but for the general public at large. And so since then, going to the movement, many people did not want to talk about HIV criminalization. They were, in my opinion, they were afraid to put it in the policies because it's such a controversial issue. It's about sex, it's about being gay or what have you. Which makes it very controversial. It's a very hot topic. And so a lot of public health people, legislators, you name it, all the people that are stakeholders who are involved in decision-making around laws and policies, they do not want to touch this. And also, there's a bit of racism, there's a bit of homophobia, transphobia, all the isms and things like that. And so people's personal biases get in the way of them, of making things better for communities of people who are already marginalized and who are also the minority. And so as I begin to, and along with some other people who I've been able to connect with who share their experiences about being prosecuted, it was through the storytelling that really changed hearts and minds of people. And even those that within the HIV community and even the LGBT community were really, really reluctant on us saying that, we do not need to be prosecuting people living with HIV. If someone does not disclose, then, people have a right to this information. But unfortunately, people don't necessarily have a right to this information because it's not legally safe for people to disclose. If we want people to disclose, we need to make it legally safe for them to do so. There have been stories of people being murdered as well as going to prison. I went to prison for 6 months, but there are people who've been convicted and gone to prison for 30 years. And they did not transmit HIV to anyone. So, let that sink in. So that is why it's so important that we need to change these laws. And so through storytelling and people really understanding the nuances of these issues, it really changed the movement in that we were able to come together and realize that that this is not acceptable for our community. And so since then, the way that we've been able to progress with change is that we started a training academy, if you will. It was organized by people living with HIV, for people living with HIV initially. And that was in 2014, which happens to also be a time when a state law actually changed. And that state was Iowa. It was the first state. And we've since had other states to change their laws, which was California, Colorado, and even North Carolina in terms of their public health code. And so through the storytelling, through the string of the nuances, through the training academy, it really has changed and build the momentum now for people wanting to change the laws in their states, so much that we have coalitions basically in most states today, particularly the South and the Midwest and other states where HIV criminalization prosecutions are definitely happening. The problem that we have limited data, which is a problem because we had to file Freedom of Information Acts to get whatever data we could in regards to the number of people who are being prosecuted. The thing is, the way the information is gathered, it makes it literally impossible to really get those numbers. But we do know it's happening because I'm a living witness that it does happen to you. And since then, I've been able to connect with a lot of other people that have been going through this experience and offering them that support. And coalitions are steady organizing because it varies from state to state. These are state laws. And so there's not just one federal law that could change, these things. It's state by state. And if we have 30 plus states, that's a lot of work. And so that means it's going to take some time to change. I actually got into this work kind of thinking for myself that, wow, if I get in, maybe I'll learn how to work this out for myself. But I decided to put that on the back burner, put myself on the back burner, and just really devote myself to really getting involved in making people aware of these laws. And instead of just retreating and just focusing on myself. And because I care about this issue, and I care about people, and I care about what happens to people in my community, in the LGBT community as well as the HIV community, in the Black community. I care about people, and that is why I do what I do. And so having the limited data, we've still been able to push forward and understanding this is not easy. Some states, for Iowa, it took them at least 7 years before they got to the point where they could actually introduce legislation to change. And so since then, those other states that I mentioned earlier, they've been able to follow suit. So it's kind of happened quickly, but it takes a long time. We still have more states to go. Some states are able to move faster than others in terms of based on their political reality. But this is serious work, and it's really hard, and it's very controversial. And so it's easy to give up because you know that things can change, things can be better, but it's the convincing the powers that be as to how that change can happen. Science is on our side. So, there's nothing else there but except people accepting the truth and accepting the facts. And so what I say to people is that, don't be discouraged. Hang in there. For me, this has been my ministry. The thing that has brought me misery, I don't know if many of you have ever faced a conviction in your life, have ever even been arrested in your life, or whatever thing that pains you. For me, this was my ministry, and it still is, and it will continue to be for the rest of my life. And the good thing that I like about it is that people now are able to speak about this for themselves and make the change. And so I encourage all people that are interested in this work to learn about it, educate yourself, because that is what's most important. Thank you. Hi, Reed.
Hey, Robert. Thank you so much, Robert. So you raised so many things in your talk just now. Mm-hmm. I think for me, one of the top things on my mind is, can you just explain very quickly for people what the science of HIV says now in terms of undetectable equals untransmittable, what HIV treatment can do to suppress viral load, and what that means for transmission?
Yeah, so I'm not the science person in the room, so I'll do my best to explain. Since the introduction of antiretroviral treatment, in the mid 90s, as I said earlier, it changed the landscape of the fact that people who thought they were dying are now being able to live longer lives. And so since that time, from 97, probably even before then, up to now, treatment has advanced tremendously and just getting us closer and closer to the point that that if a person is on treatment and they have like the virus is at certain levels in their body, and if they're on treatment, it brings the virus down, the viral load down. To the point we were able to detect the HIV in blood. But now with the way that the medicine is effective, it brings it down to zero to the point where they can't even detect it. Now, the individual is still HIV positive, but they cannot detect it in the virus in the blood, which means that the person cannot transmit the virus to another individual if they're engaging in sex.
Thanks, Robert. Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
No
So
problem.
I think it's very helpful just to give that as some background, because not everybody, so I'm living with HIV, you are, so sometimes we know some of these details that others might not know. Right. In terms of on going over that again, so just to recap this, if somebody living with HIV is on medication and gets to a virally suppressed level, so under 200 copies per milliliter, and they're not able to sexually transmit HIV.
Right.
So if they were to have consensual sex, they're not able to sexually transmit HIV to that individual. Yet these state statutes are still on the books that treat any interaction with an HIV positive person as though it's a potential murder, right, of another individual. Right. So when these statutes came online in the early 90s mostly, there was that fear, that hysteria, lack of information.
Right.
And it has literally enshrined into law that HIV stigma that then added to oppressing people with HIV, people of color specifically,
Right.
and people are facing these criminalization statutes.
Potentially, yes.
Potentially, yeah. So I thank you for really bringing that to light. So can you explain also what that means for where you see racial justice in the HIV movement and HIV activism and advocacy needing to be more of a focus?
Yeah, and I like to highlight the term racial justice because HIV, I'm originally from the South, and so in the South, the epidemic is so prevalent, and it's mostly prevalent among the Black community or the African American community. And so, in the sphere of talking about biomedical, research, a lot of it, it's good information, it's helping the community. However, the people that are suffering or sort of left out of this is the Black community. Due to all sorts of inequities, racial inequities, and having access to health care, and then also the barriers, in terms of the criminal justice system. And so there are barriers that are created where even, economic barriers where people don't have the resources that they need in order to, live productive and full lives. And so I highlight racial justice because it's so easy to talk about communities of people living with HIV, but we also need to look a little deeper at who actually is impacted and who's left out. And so if it's the Black people that are being impacted, Black people need to also be at the decision-making table. They need to be in leadership in order to make the best decisions that in regards to issues that impact them. And so what I'm seeing is that that's not happening as much, and we need to encourage more support around racial equity as well as racial justice within the HIV movement, as well, and even other movements broadly.
I know one of the kind of slogans from early HIV activism was people who are directly affected need to be part of the response. So in HIV criminalization, you as somebody who was directly affected really became a leader in that response. So what you're saying, I think, is also there need to be resources to make that possible, and really to, how do you see your own leadership as being kind of cultivated and helped along the way, as opposed to, did you just wake up one day and say, I need to do this, or were there kind of people along the way who helped you and supported you?
I would say at first I didn't want to be a leader because I didn't really know what that involved as far as speaking out, but really I've learned that it's just really about sharing your experience with people, and so I've sort of grown into that role. For me, I think coming into the community and connecting with other strong leaders, and not just men, but also women, living with HIV, been so inspired by the movement of the women's movement in terms of the HIV community and how they come together and how they speak out in regards to issues and doing work around comprehensive sexual reproductive rights and things like that. And so I've just tried to use my leadership as to support and inspire people and to help where I can. And do I feel like I've been supported? I think so. I mean, I've been able to connect with you as a friend and colleague through the years, and been people that I could lean on. And so, I've just not tried to make it about me and just really make it more about helping our community move forward, and just try to do my best to highlight things that need to be highlighted on platforms wherever I can.
Thanks, Robert. One of the questions that just came in online was, is it different speaking to different generations about HIV criminalization or your work in general? Oh,
it really is. For those who are long-term survivors and people who were much older. I'm 40, by the way. I know some that think I'm
very
younger.
Young 40.
So yes, I have learned that it's a little different because they lived in a different time. They lived in a time where people were dying, literally dying, and I totally get that, and I was probably a little baby during those times. But nonetheless, the laws, what I say is that the laws don't change. They have not changed. And so no matter if you're a person living with HIV from back in the day to a newly diagnosed person today, no matter how you may have contracted HIV, those laws are still the same. They will be applied to each and every individual in the same manner. And for some people, depending on how they identify, because we all don't live single-issue lives, sometimes the punishment can be even greater. There are sentence enhancements if people are found to be injecting drug users or sex workers and living with HIV. And so it really affects a lot of us in ways that many people may not even be aware of. And so generationally speaking, there definitely have been differences.
I know the title of your talk was that this work is not a sprint but a marathon. What are the things that you think people in racial justice, social justice movements need to hear from individuals like yourself who are directly affected by an issue about support for the marathon, not the sprint?
Yeah, I would say, connect with people who are actually impacted by your cause. Do your best to connect them, gather them, empower them as leaders, let them speak. That is so important because when I came into the movement, the thing is that they've been talking about HIV criminalization. They just didn't have anybody to talk about it themselves. So in essence, I feel like the movement was looking for me, in a sense, even though I wasn't necessarily looking for them, but I'm glad that we were able to connect, and I'm really grateful for that. But I encourage other social movement leaders, connect with the people who are impacted. Do your work intersectionally. You get along further in that. We're learning how to do that, not just to be about HIV, but also to go broader in terms of other issues around racial justice, economic justice, reproductive rights, things like that. I did have another point, but I can't remember it right now. But those are the two. Those are the two that really stand out for me.
Thank you so much, Robert. So if we get your point later, we'll include it in the online conversation. Right. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.
Thanks, Reed. Appreciate that. I'm going to take this. All right. Thanks, Robert. I appreciate it.